You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
And now, here's your host.
Welcome back to the program. I'm Zev Brenner. We got a wonderful show for you tonight, but we have Rabbi Marty Katz. He's a good friend, the founding executive vice chairman of the Just One Life organization, been featured so many times over the years, and he works with the Jewish community, he works with the Christian community, works with Pastor Hagee, and for the last 6 months, maybe a year, he kept telling me, Zev, you have to put on Shari Dollinger on the air. You got to put her on. I said yes, and we kept talking, and took a while, but we're finally here. She's the co-executive director of Christians United for Israel. But Rabbi Marty, let me begin with you. Let's begin the program. You introduce our special guest. I know you know for a number of years, and there's a lot going on that I think is so important for us to be working together with the Christian community. So welcome back.
Zev, it's always a pleasure to be on the show and always to get a certain amount of encouragement for the work I do for Just One Life, and thank God some of the other projects. I'm always proud of this special relationship I've had with Diana and Pastor John Hagee for the last decade. I can't even describe the amounts of money and thus babies that have been born thanks to them.
Let me just tell everyone, Just One Life in Israel, what they do is if a woman, for economic reasons, doesn't want to have a child, you will take away that burden of finances and give them money and help support the family. So it's a wonderful institution. We don't have it in the United States as far as I know, but in Israel they do amazing work. So that's what Just One Life does.
Thank you. Thank you. You always say,
I can go work for JOL, right?
Listen, I'm working for you. I got you, Shari. I believe you're going to thank me for this one. Okay, you're going to thank me.
All right. I'm sorry. I just couldn't resist.
But we have to behave ourselves because Shari's watching us operate together.
I'm enjoying it.
Ladies and gentlemen, so as a result of this relationship, I've gone to Christians United for Israel conferences for as many years as I can know and remember. And it's fascinating. And if they say I'm in the Hatzalah business in terms of saving babies' lives in a unique formula, with a formula of love and not screaming, you'll understand when you hear what Shari speaks about. She saves lives. What she's accomplished in 100 to 200 universities by having people protect our Holy Land and worry about all that's going on in the world. And I don't even want to talk about it. I won't do justice to it. Ladies and gentlemen, that has to do with Shari Dollinger and, of course, the other co-director, my dear friend, Diana Hagee. So it's a big schut. It's a tremendous privilege for me to go out of the arena of Just One Life and to say there is a very special lady you're going to hear from. And that's Shari Dollinger from Atlanta, Georgia, who his scope is worldwide in her knowledge and helping train people on campus to deal with all sorts of issues. So, Zev, you're a lucky person today.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Okay. I'm not letting you off the hook so quickly.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay. I have to say goodbye, but I have to find a hook to get myself out. I'm showing my age. Okay. To the two young ones.
Rabbi Marty Katz, thank you for the introduction, both off the air and on the air. So thank you, Rabbi Marty Katz, founding executive vice chairman, Just One Life organization.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome. Okay.
Okay. So, Shari, let me welcome you officially to the program. I heard so much about what you do. Perhaps we should start by explaining to our audience the origin and what do Christians United for Israel do on a day-to-day basis.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I've heard wonderful things about you through the years from Rabbi Katz, and it's a pleasure to be here. So just kind of the 30,000-foot view into Kufai, and we can dive deeper in areas of interest. You were a relatively new organization when it comes to the Jewish and pro-Israel space. We just celebrated our 16th anniversary. And in February 2006, I was privileged to be in the room. Pastor Hagee called together 400 leading evangelicals, and he said, I want to create an organization that is solely focused on Israel and combating anti-Semitism, that is non-conversionary, non-partisan, and supports the Israeli government. And miraculously, all 400 leaders stayed. And 16 years later, we've grown from 400 to over 11.5 million. And it's been It's been a miracle. It's been a blessing from above, and a leadership from Pastor and Diana. And so, we're more than, just a grassroots online organization. We are very much, especially praise God, post-COVID, in person on campus, as Rabbi Katz mentioned. We're on over 300 campuses, but we also, the bulk of what we do is focused on the U.S.-Israel relationship and combating anti-Semitism. So we do 50 events a month, 50, in churches and communities across the country, and educate about why people should care about Israel, and then motivate them to what they can do. And part of that motivation is speaking to their members of Congress face-to-face in Washington. Our upcoming CUFI Summit is in about a week and a half. And we'll have thousands of Christians from all 50 states come to Washington and speak to their members of Congress about the importance of a strong U.S.-Israel relationship.
That's amazing. It's so important. We need that. We need all the friends we can get. But it's amazing how many events you do each month. So I'm impressed. I didn't realize how much you're doing. And I assume also you probably plan trips to Israel as well.
Thank you for asking.
Ministers.
So, it's a small part of what we do, but a very significant portion. So average year, we do about 20 trips to Israel, and all of these are invite only. So we do pastors' trips, like you mentioned. Pastors have a heart for Israel. They have biblical knowledge. It transcends a spiritual plane when you step foot in the land. And 8 days in the land, and pastors come back on fire for Israel. They come into our leadership. They're preaching sermons on Israel. They're sharing on social media. And one pastor going to Israel impacts an entire congregation, an entire community. Then we also do campus trips. As Rabbi Katz mentioned, our students are really on the front lines fighting for Judeo-Christian values, and in a way to motivate them, excite them, explain to them how this is real, we bring a group of students to campus students to Israel every year. And then lastly, we bring millennial influencers. Almost a decade ago, we realized that Israel was starting to have a hasbara issue, a public relations issue when it came to evangelical millennials. And so instead of wringing our hands and talking about it, we do what we do, which is we got down to work. And right after the war with Gaza in August 14, we took our first Israel Collective, that's the name of our millennial initiative, our first Israel Collective trip to Israel. Subsequently, we've taken 30 buses of Israel Collective influencers. We're talking about former Miss Americas, NFL players, baseball players, bloggers, folks with huge social media influences, so that they can reach and teach the next generation about Israel.
I'm glad you mentioned the next generation, because I'm hearing this from pastors that are telling me that the next generation of Christian evangelicals are not as pro-Israel, they're pro-Palestinians. I've heard countless pastors tell me that. So I'm glad to see you taking some students and campus students to Israel, but from what I'm hearing, it's more of an issue than we realize as to what the narrative is changing, and I'm curious to get your perspective on that.
So, like I mentioned, we saw some signs that were troubling a decade ago, and we took action then. There have recently been some polls published within the last few years. We don't take them very seriously because the signs that we're seeing on the ground, and like I mentioned, with 11.5 million members, it's a sizable membership, and we have a really sense of a pulse of what's going on in churches across the country. We feel that these polls have been really blown out of proportion. What we're seeing is continuation of the support. Now, there are nuances that are different. And so when you look at our Israel Collective films and our Israel Collective newsletters, the imagery, I say, is lighter. The conversations are more around social justice, but social justice when it comes to Israel. At the end of the day, the core messaging is the same, that God gave the land to the Jewish people. This is the Jewish homeland, and we're going to stand and support a strong U.S.-Israel relationship. How you sometimes speak of it is different in this generation because they hear words differently, but we are able to transcend that with having Christian millennials speak to Christian millennials and turn this tide.
No, I think it's very important, but forgive me, what I'm hearing, again, I'm not involved in the day-to-day activity. I can only tell you what I hear from pastors, but in the Jewish community, there's a problem. When young Jews go to secular colleges, you have an atmosphere that's anti-Israel, anti-religion. It's more woke. So even good kids will sometimes, even Jewish kids won't walk away with the same perspective on Israel. So some pastors told me when you have Christian evangelicals, young students go to these woke colleges, which they permeate throughout the country, they're also influenced by them in a negative way regarding Israel. So it's important that we reach out to them, and I totally concur.
Sure.
I'm just saying what I'm hearing, and I'm wondering how much of a basis is there, because I see it in the Jewish community, a lot of young people not as interested in Israel as they should be.
So what we've seen in polling reveals that the more often you go to church, the more likely you are to support Israel. And so the students that we work with on campus are very involved with their churches, involved in their communities. So we are not seeing that dip. A great example, we just brought a group of NFL players to Israel in February, and we had a very distinguished, very senior member of the Jewish community with us. And he turned to me and he said, I'm just amazed at how pro-Israel these folks are. I've brought similar folks to Israel, but they just weren't asking these questions. They weren't as engaged. And I said, the difference is these are Christian NFL players. And at the end of the day, it's the first word in our name. And so, Christians laugh that we're really Christians uniting Christians, because a lot of Christians become closer to each other, closer to their faith through supporting Israel. But it's to Israel's advantage that the more you read your Bible, the more you're in church, the more supportive you're going to be. And therefore, when our Kufa campus students are on campus and they're working with kids who are in church, who they're engaged with their Bible, we don't see any type of dip. Now, it's a broader Christian issue of getting the kids in church and getting them engaging with their Bible. But for us and with those that we work with in this space, they love Israel like their parents.
We're speaking with Shari Dollinger, the co-executive director of Christians United for Israel. She serves as co-executive director together with Deanna Hagee. So I love what Christians United for Israel is doing. It's so important. The Jewish community needs support, and maybe Jews can learn from what Kufi is doing. I'm curious to know, you are yourself, or you're an observant Jew, you're active in the Jewish community. What's it like working with a group, Christian United for Israel? Was there any challenge that you have being a Jew working with the organization? I'm curious to get your perspective.
I love this question, because I think that some people are surprised by my answer, that I've actually become stronger in my Judaism. My spirituality has dramatically strengthened by working with Christians. It's been over 15 years that I've been blessed to work for the Hagees. And while my observance levels always remain the same, kosher, I have gotten deeper into Jewish spirituality because I see how incredibly spiritual my Christian colleagues are, and how they have personal relationships with God. And I grew up conservative, and we, the conservative movement, it's very, I would say, very scripted prayer and not that much spontaneous prayer. And my Christian friends inspired me to go deeper into Jewish texts and get more invested in reading Kabbalah and Tanya and deeper Torah study. And I study Parsha every week. I actually give a Parsha talk to my team every Monday. And because of the deep reverence my Christian colleagues have for their Jewish roots and their love and support of me, not only as a person, but my family and my children's Jewish education, it's really inspired me to reinvigorate my Judaism.
No, it's terrific, because I love the passion. I don't know if I told you, I think it was about 20 years ago, Ed McAteer, if you heard of Ed McAteer, he had a group of Christians and Jews go to Israel on a 36-hour mission. I was part of that mission. It was a great trip, by the way.
Tremendous.
Great trip. I loved the passion, the spirituality that they had. But one of the things that I hear, and you hear it too, Shari, the elephant in the room is, well, how could you work with evangelicals? They're good supporters of Israel. At the end of the day, want to convert us to Christianity. You hear that all the time. How do you deal with it?
So, first of all, the reason they support Israel is biblical. It is Genesis 12:3, and you see it poured out with our membership that if you bless Israel, you'll be blessed. If you curse Israel, you'll be cursed. And, Pastor Hagee kids, that's his mission, and he isn't doing very well. I mean, he's kids, but he's true. I mean, we are non-conversionary first and foremost, and they support Israel for Judeo-Christian values, for Israel, who Israel was biblically, and almost as importantly, who Israel is currently, and their love and respect for the Jewish roots. What my Christian colleagues will tell you is that God is a promise keeper, and that if God is going to keep his promises to them, then he's going to keep his promises to Israel. So no, it is not about converting us. It is not about any type of nefarious motives that people attach to this relationship to destroy it, because some folks are uncomfortable with it. It's become too powerful. It's become too important. It doesn't fit into people's narrative of what the pro-Israel community could and should be. In reality, it is a beautiful mosaic of exactly what the pro-Israel community should be. We, CUFI, give strength to the Jewish community in ways that the Jewish community sees and sometimes doesn't see. And those in the Jewish community that have recognized it, come alongside us, worked with us, appreciate it. And it's really, I've been doing this work for almost 20 years. It really now is the outskirts of folks who are, quote, uncomfortable with it. And there was a huge shift post Second Intifada when people realized truly how slim our support can be in the States and how important it is to have allies and friends. And post Second Intifada, you hear less of that, and you hear a lot more appreciation than pushing away.
I agree. We just had Pat Boone on the other day, who is a strong supporter. I love Pat Boone. He's going strong. He's 88, but thank God he still has it. And he wrote the song Exodus, This Land Is My Land. And I just recall his story, which I'm sure you would appreciate, where he said he was, I believe, in the Golan Heights, and some Israelis were questioning, do we really need the Golan Heights? Let's give it back. What do we need it for? He gets up and he starts singing, This Land Is My Land. That was his answer. So you have to love it.
You would just love it. It's so... It's black and white. It's in the Bible. It's the land for the Jewish people. And I think sometimes, my Christian friends have to remind us that it's okay. It's your land and you should embrace it and you shouldn't apologize for it.
Now, what are some of the challenges? Because we live in a woke society. The values of secular America has shifted more woke, more against religion. There is a war against religion in the United States. And being involved with Christian United for Israel, is it harder to reach non-Christians with your message? Because while you're gearing yourself to Christians, but you also want everybody to know what you're doing.
We do, and there's no doubt about it. Before I would feel comfortable getting into any Uber or any audience, and this is who I am and this is what I do. And in our polarized society, religion and politics, it didn't used to, quote, be a polite conversation, but now it's, not beyond polite conversation. So I'm actually guarded and could not be, more proud of what I do, but I'm more guarded about who I speak to about it, honestly, from a security perspective, which is heartbreaking. And like I said before, we are interested in Christians who are predisposed to support Israel, meaning they read their Bible literally. And it is a fight that others need to fight in terms of getting folks in synagogue and in churches, because once you do, they're going to be Zionists. And so we have enough low-lying fruit. Pastor Hagee says there's a potential of 100 million Christians in the United States who are predisposed to support Israel, meaning reading their Bible literally. And those are the 100 million that we target. Of course, if we do billboards or if we do ads or we do TV commercials like we just did on Fox News, we're looking beyond the 100 million. But really, we see our base, our potential of being the core of Christians in this country who are biblically literate.
So Shari Dollinger is our guest, and we're looking at Christians United for Israel. She serves as the co-executive director of the organization. You mentioned there are about 11.5 million members, which is very impressive, what you have that belong to Christians United for Israel. You mentioned you're doing a media campaign or have done one, whether it's on Fox and elsewhere, to get more Christians involved in Christians United for Israel. I'm curious to know, when you do these kinds of campaigns, what kind of response do you get of people being more involved with your organization?
So the one I just mentioned on Fox was an anomaly for us, and it speaks to Pastor and Diana's heart. So when Ukraine was invaded on February 24th, we obviously were deeply concerned about all the Ukrainians, in the Jewish community. But typically, something like working with Ukrainian Jewish refugees or Olim would be a little bit out of our mission statement. As I mentioned, we're focused on anti-Semitism and supporting Israel. But Pastor Hagee called me very early in the morning on March 6th and said, if we can't help Ukrainian Jews right now, what are we doing? And so we mobilized immediately, got approval from the board, and within 24 hours had ads on Fox News, and within 24 hours had raised $1 million for the Jewish Agency to bring Ukrainian Jews out of Ukraine and fly them to get them to Israel. Subsequently, since that day, we've raised close to $9 million. We're at about $8.8 million. Many of those dollars were raised through this campaign where, I believe it was mid-March, Pastor Diana and I were in Israel, and we went to the tarmac of Ben Gurion, and we met the second plane load of Ukrainian Jews who had escaped Ukraine very early in the war, that plane was coming from Hungary, had flew to Israel, and we handed them Israeli flags and suckers for the kids and welcomed them to their new homeland. And and Pastor just said, this is the heart of who we are as CUFI, that we need to support and embrace these new Olim. And so through this effort, millions of more people have heard about what the work that we do. And, those who may be less inclined, I would say, to necessarily maybe at first coalesce around an anti-BDS campaign or, a specific piece of legislation, their hearts are opened when it comes to helping refugees. And then we have an opportunity to educate more about current political realities that Israel faces.
No, it's so important. I'm glad that you raised a lot of money to help Ukrainian Jews. And while your basic mission is to educate Christians in this country to fight anti-Semitism, against BDS, let's look at some of those efforts. So how are you fighting anti-Semitism? How are you fighting BDS?
So we've been looking at BDS as a state level initiative, and over the course of particularly the last 2.5 years and beyond that, we
stopped buying Ben and Jerry's ice cream.
We were very early on that. That news broke when we were in Dallas at our summit. We took a year off from DC during COVID, and we met in Dallas. We were immediately sprang into action, contacting all those parties that were interested in Unilever, and we led that fight along with the Conference of Presidents and other Jewish organizations that we work very closely with. So, like I said before, the Jewish community, who understands the importance of our numbers and the leverage that we have, welcomes us with open arms. And so we work in coalition, and we've worked in coalition with many Jewish organizations on state level anti-BDS legislation, successfully, thank God so. And now there's still work to be done on some states that need to either improve or adopt anti-BDS legislation. We're focusing more and more on Holocaust education at the state level. And as you know, anything having to do with education policy at a state level is a bit, I'd say, traumatic, tumultuous, but we don't shy away from a fight. And it's imperative that there is serious Holocaust education at the state level in schools, public schools throughout the country. That actually was the impetus. We just got back last week from a really intense trip to Poland and Israel, stemmed from that NFL trip that I mentioned. In February, we brought a group of NFL players, and walking into Yad Vashem, one of the NFL players said to a colleague of mine, remind me what the Holocaust is. Once you learn about the Holocaust, you never forget the Holocaust. So really what he was saying is, what is the Holocaust? And that shook me to my core. An educated man, high socioeconomic standing, and he never learned about the Holocaust. And so what we did 3 weeks ago is we brought 3 massive social media influencers to Poland, to Auschwitz, Birkenau, Majdanek, to current Jewish communities in Poland, to learn about the history of anti-Semitism, the reality of what's going on in Poland, so that they could then reach their networks literally from Auschwitz and from Birkenau and from Majdanek and educate at a very grassroots level about the Holocaust. We then took them to the border with Poland and Ukraine. We met with refugees, and we flew on the Jewish Agency flight from Warsaw to Tel Aviv with new Olim. So we told many stories within the course of a week, but the linchpin was Holocaust education. And we are gearing up this new legislative season. Mostly we'll kick off in January in state houses across the country with serious Holocaust education initiatives in a myriad of states.
Now, I know the Christians United for Israel operates throughout the United States. I'm curious to know what it's like in the New York area, because in the New York area, you don't have as many evangelical Christians as you do, let's say, in Atlanta, other parts of the country. I know they exist there. I'd like to know about your efforts in the metropolitan New York area.
So It's actually perfect timing to ask the question because we have a brand new CUFI field coordinator who is in charge of New York, who his name is Kasim Hafiz. And Kasim, as evidenced by his name, did not grow up Jewish, did not grow up Christian. Grew up a Pakistani Muslim in London. I could spend a half an hour talking about Kasim. I won't. We did a full feature-length movie on Kasim and our dear friend Irving Roth, who's a Holocaust survivor who passed last year, called Never Again ? So Kasim is now taking over New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, and Connecticut for us. And we've made inroads in all four of those states. As you said, there aren't as many evangelical Christians in the Northeast as there are in the Bible Belt throughout, the Southwest, Midwest. But that doesn't mean that we aren't active, that we don't have chapters. And we're going to even be more so with Kasim invested in the state, and would love to, introduce you to Kasim.
No, it sounds fascinating because I see activity around the country, but New York is a different kind of place. New Jersey, Connecticut, similar. So that's why I was curious about the activities of the Christians United for Israel in this area. But I'm glad to hear you have here, and it looks like you're going to be ramping up to do some more.
Exactly.
So before I let you go, what's your biggest challenge?
It's a great question. I would say our biggest challenge sometimes, and this is just speaking to in the Jewish community, and you hit on it before. I think the Jewish community has a warped perception of who we are and what we do, and that's why I really appreciate opportunities like this to come on and to explain we are not proselytizing, to explain that the Christians do not believe in a certain theology, that they're invested in all Jews being in Israel, that really we are who we say we are. And we have a track record of 16 years, and Pastor Hagee a track record of over 40 years of unconditionally supporting the state of Israel and the Jewish people. And that it gives my family a great sense of security, especially in these days and these times when it is scary to be raising Jewish children, going to Jewish day school, that I know there's 11.5 million Christians who have our back. I'll bring my children, they're almost 13 and 14, to CUFI events to say, these folks love you for who you are. They love you unconditionally. They love you. You're Jewish. They love that. They're not trying to convert you, and they're here to support you. And in a time like this, we need all the friends we can get, not only supporting Israel, but the Jewish community in the United States.
No, it's so important. I'm curious, in the Jewish community, we have a Birthright Israel. We send young Jews to Israel to experience it. They will come back transformed. People said to me, and I know you're sending teens and millennials to Israel, but is there a movement or even a thought of doing a Christian Birthright for Israel?
There's another organization that does that, and they do it exceptionally well. We target, for budgetary reasons and the fact that we're not strictly a campus organization, we target student leaders. Passages does kind of a Christian Birthright, where if you're Christian, you can go to Israel, and it's important. But for the focus of our organization and for financial reasons, we've decided to go with student leaders.
Shari Dollinger, Co-Executive Director, Christians United for Israel. We appreciate you being here with us. It's so important that we have the lines of communication. So I think the Jewish community, those that are aware of what you and the evangelical Christians are doing for Israel, are very appreciative, because it's so important to have friends. And 11.5 million friends in the United States, considering the Jewish community is 6 million or less, and a lot of the Jewish community is assimilated, unidentified with Israel. So it gives us a major boost. So thank you for all that you're doing.
Thank you, Zev.
And I thank my good friend, Rabbi Marty Katz, Executive Vice President, founding Executive Vice President, Just One Life, for making the introduction. But we hope you'll join us again.
Thanks for listening.
For continuous Jewish programs, TalklineNetwork.com. We're our 24-hour-a-day listen line at 641-741-0389. For past shows, you can find us on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, Instagram, and all major podcast platforms, or jewishpodcast.org. Thanks for listening to the TalklineNetwork.com.